Hello everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It really helps YouTube show you more stories like this one. Now let's get started. 7 a.m. when I found myself alone on Crescent Lake, Maine, sitting in a small, narrow canoe that rocked gently with each subtle movement of the water. The lake was almost completely still, but the fog clung low to the surface, thick and wet, swallowing the trees and hiding the shoreline. I could barely see the end of my paddle as it sliced through the water, making small, muffled splashes that felt impossibly loud in the quiet of the night. Everything was silent except for the soft lapping of water against the sides of the canoe, the rhythm of my strokes, and the occasional distant croak of a frog or rustle of a tree branch. Even the wind had died down entirely. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every sound feel unnatural, as if the world has paused, holding its breath. I had been on the lake for nearly an hour, hoping the solitude would give me clarity. My flashlight was in the dry bag along with my phone, which I knew wouldn't have reception here anyway. The mist was so thick I couldn't even see the other side of the lake. My reflection in the water looked almost like a double of myself, pale and distorted, and I had to blink a few times to remind myself that I was awake. I paddled slowly, careful not to disturb the stillness too much, feeling the cold seep through the thin material of my jacket. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on my ears. A faint sound drifted over the water, soft and low, almost like someone whispering my name. I froze, gripping the paddle tighter. The voice was so quiet it could have been the wind, but there was no wind. The fog seemed to thicken around me, closing in. My heart started beating faster, the sound of it deafening in the unnatural quiet. Alex. It was my name. Clear, soft, deliberate. My throat went dry. I turned my head slowly, scanning the gray blanket that covered the lake. There was nothing. No one. Just the mist and the endless dark water. I told myself it was my imagination, that it had to be. I had spent too long alone on this lake, and my mind was probably playing tricks. I paddled a little, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then it came again, louder this time, closer, and it overlapped strangely with my own thoughts. It was like my brain and the voice were colliding, repeating my name in a rhythm that made my stomach tighten. My muscles tensed. I tried to call out to answer, but my voice sounded tiny and distant, swallowed by the fog. My ears strained, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to move with me, always just out of reach. Then the water changed. I noticed it first as a subtle vibration against the hull of the canoe. At first, I thought it was my paddle hitting something underwater, a branch or a rock, but the ripples didn't make sense. They spread in all directions, sudden and unnatural. The surface of the lake, which had been perfectly still a moment ago, began to swell and ripple violently, though the air remained calm, still and cold. The canoe rocked more aggressively with each pulse. I felt the tension in my arms and legs, my grip on the paddle straining as I tried to steady myself. And then I saw it. A pale figure, rising from the water, maybe 10 feet away. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, my reflection distorted by the ripples. But it was solid enough to cast a faint shadow, pale against the dark water. The shape looked humanoid, but wrong in a way I couldn't define. Its skin seemed almost gray, wet and glistening, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. There were no eyes I could make out, only the suggestion of a face, blurred and shifting with the fog. I froze, unable to move, my entire body rigid with fear. I paddled back instinctively, but my strokes were clumsy. The canoe swung dangerously as I tried to steer it, water splashing over the sides. Every time I looked back, the figure seemed to linger, following me in a way that didn't make sense. I could hear my name again, clearer than before, and the sound was coming from everywhere, the water, the air, the fog itself. My lungs burned as I paddled faster, adrenaline surging. I could barely see the dock through the fog, but I aimed for it, desperate for solid ground. When I finally reached the dock, my heart pounding, I leaped out of the canoe, letting it bump against the wooden posts. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. The fog still wrapped the lake in a thick, suffocating blanket. I looked around frantically. No one was there. The dock was empty. The shoreline seemed deserted. And yet, my name echoed from the water. It wasn't a whisper now. It was loud and distorted, as if the lake itself was speaking, twisting my voice back at me. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the dock, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or my imagination, or something trapped in the fog. I spent what felt like hours sitting on the dock, staring at the dark water. My hands shook, my teeth chattered, and my clothes were soaked from splashes as I had struggled in the canoe. The ripples on the lake eventually slowed, returning to their unnatural calm. The fog began to thin, letting in the first pale light of morning. The figure never appeared again, and the lake returned to its peaceful, empty state. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the mist in shades of orange and pink, I realized that I was safe for now. The lake looked normal in daylight, serene and inviting. Birds returned to the trees, insects began their morning songs, and the water reflected the sky like any ordinary lake. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that something in those dark hours had been alive in a way I couldn't understand. I packed up my canoe slowly, every sound from the surrounding woods and water making me flinch. My hands were still trembling, and my mind kept replaying the image of that pale figure, the silent scream, and the echoing voice calling my name. I told myself it was a hallucination, a product of exhaustion, isolation, and fear, but deep down, I knew something had been there, something that could imitate my voice and move through the water in ways no one should be able to. I left Crescent Lake that morning feeling drained, but strangely alert. Every time I looked over my shoulder at the water, a shiver ran through me. I didn't speak of what happened to anyone, because I knew no one would believe me. I didn't even try to call it a ghost or some mythical creature. There was nothing fantastical about it. It was real, in a sense that made my stomach churn. It was something that existed in the natural world, something that could manipulate sound and water in ways I couldn't explain. Weeks later, I returned to the lake in daylight to leave offerings, markers, anything that could keep me calm. I noticed the subtle disturbances in the water, small ripples when no wind blew, strange patterns near the docks, reflections that didn't quite match reality. I stayed far from the center of the lake, never going out at night again. The memory of my name echoing through the fog remained, clear and visceral, as if the lake had claimed it. I've learned to live with it. I know Crescent Lake is quiet, still, and beautiful in the day. But I also know what waits in the dark hours, just beneath the surface, patient and unseen. And every time I hear a faint echo, a sound that shouldn't be there, I remember that night. I remember the way the water moved, the figure that emerged, and the voice that sounded like me but wasn't me. I never go out after dark anymore, and I never will. Some places, some things, exist in a way that defies explanation, and Crescent Lake is one of them. That night changed me. I don't need stories or legends to feel fear anymore. I only need the memory of the lake, the fog, the sound of my name being carried across the water, and the knowledge that it could happen again at any time, to anyone, in the thick, suffocating silence of Crescent Lake. It is real. It is silent. And it waits. I moved into apartment 3B last week. It's an old building in Boston, the kind with creaky floors and faded paint peeling at the edges of the walls. The kind of place that smells faintly of mildew and old carpet, no matter how many times you clean. I had signed the lease quickly, eager to get away from my last cramped studio. I didn't think much about the building's history or the rumors about the tenants who came and went too fast. I just wanted a place of my own, a space where I could feel normal. The first night, I unpacked my boxes, set up the small kitchen, and arranged the furniture in the living room the way I liked it. The apartment felt empty, silent, and for the first hour, peaceful. But then around 11, I started hearing it. At first, I thought it was the pipes. The building is old, after all, and I've lived in places where heating systems knock and whistle. The sound was coming from my bedroom wall, the one that backed up to the next apartment. A soft knocking, steady but irregular, like someone tapping on the wall with their knuckles. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, just the old building settling. I lay in bed, listening, and eventually the sound faded enough that I drifted off. But I didn't sleep well. I woke several times in the night to the same knocking, louder than before, like someone was impatient. And then at one point, I heard something else. A faint whisper. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding, straining to hear. It came again. Don't sleep. It was soft, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the city outside, but it was there. I froze, listening. The words repeated a few times, low and urgent. I called it my imagination and pulled the blankets over my head, trying to calm my racing heart. The next night, I was on edge. I checked every lock, every window, every door, even the ones I knew were fine. I turned on the small desk lamp and left it on, trying to keep the darkness at bay. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, clearer. "Look under the bed." I froze. My mind refused to accept it, but the words were there, insistent and deliberate. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But curiosity, that terrible itch, got the better of me. I knelt beside the bed and leaned down. My stomach twisted when I saw a note lying there. It was soaked in something dark, sticky, that glistened faintly in the light. The handwriting was messy, jagged, almost like it had been written in a hurry. "I see you through the walls." The words made my skin crawl. I pressed the note flat against the floor, unsure whether to throw it away or keep it. I felt like the apartment itself was watching me. I turned my head toward the corner of the room. There was a shadow crouched there. I swear it moved just slightly, but in the exact same way I moved, as if it were mimicking me. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the lamp, a play of shadows in the corner, but every time I shifted, it shifted with me. I didn't sleep that night. I just stayed on the bed, eyes fixed on the corner, heart hammering. Every sound in the apartment made me flinch. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the radiator, every faint thump from the walls felt deliberate, like it was time to scare me. By the third night, I was exhausted. I stayed up until 2, sitting on the couch with a blanket over my shoulders. The whispering came again, even with the lights on, even with music playing softly from my phone. It didn't matter what I did. I stopped opening the note. I stopped looking at the corner. But the knocking kept coming. The whispering kept coming. Every sound in the apartment seemed amplified, sinister, deliberate. I started checking the walls more carefully. The apartment is old. The plaster is thin in some places, and you can see the outlines of pipes and wires if you look closely. I ran my fingers along the walls, pressing into the cracks, listening. Sometimes I thought I could hear breathing from behind the walls, soft and shallow. I started leaving doors open, lights on, anything to make it feel like I wasn't alone, but that didn't help. I began to avoid looking in mirrors, feeling like the shadow would somehow appear there too. The breaking point came on the 4th night. I had tried everything, sleeping with the lights on, running a fan for white noise, keeping the TV on. None of it worked. At 11:13, as always, the knocking started. This time it was faster, more insistent, and the whisper came almost immediately. I didn't even hear words at first, just a hissing, like someone breathing heavily. Then I understood. "Look under the bed." I froze. I didn't want to look. I couldn't. My hands were shaking as I knelt slowly, dragging the note from under the bed. It was there again, wet, smeared. I couldn't tell if it was the same as before, or if someone had left it again. I backed up slowly, my eyes locked on the corner of the room. The shadow was there again. It didn't crouch this time. It simply stood, and every movement I made was mirrored perfectly. My first thought was that someone had broken in, was hiding in the apartment, copying me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I had to get out. I grabbed my coat and my keys and ran down the stairs, nearly slipping on the worn wooden steps, and I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the street, cold air cutting through me. I didn't go back that night. I stayed in my car, parked a block away, waiting until sunrise. I couldn't call anyone. I didn't want anyone to see me like that, my hands trembling, my eyes wide. I thought about my apartment, about the walls, about what was behind them. I realized I didn't need ghosts or monsters to be scared, just the idea that someone could be in there, silently copying me, silently watching me. The next day I went back, not to sleep, not to confront it, but to get my things. I brought a friend, someone I trusted. We checked every corner, every closet, every inch of the apartment. Nothing. No shadow, no note, nothing behind the walls. Everything looked normal. The building had been quiet, almost too quiet. But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had seen, or thought I had seen. I didn't need proof anymore. I packed everything and left. I signed a new lease the same day. I moved to a different neighborhood, a newer building with solid walls and security cameras. I still think about apartment 3B, especially when I'm alone at night. I still feel that same tightness in my chest when I hear a noise in the apartment I live in now. And I never, ever leave my bed without checking under it first. I realized something important from that experience. Fear doesn't need a ghost or a monster to be real. It can live in a creak, a shadow, a note left where you least expect it. It can live in the knowledge that someone, or something, might be watching you, copying your movements, knowing exactly where you are at every moment. That fear can stay with you, long after you leave the place where it started. It can shape your instincts, your habits, the way you move in your own home. And in the end, that fear is real enough. I don't live in apartment 3B anymore, and I never will. I've made sure of that. I've learned to trust my instincts, to respect the small signals that something isn't right. And for the first time in a long time, I can sleep at night. Not because I'm safe, but because I control my space now. Because I know that running and leaving, rather than fighting an unseen threat, was the only way to take back my life. I still feel that tightening in my chest when I think about those nights, but it no longer has power over me. I survived it. I left it behind. And that finally is enough. I was jogging through Willow Creek Park in Oregon that night, the clock on my phone reading 9:17 p.m. The park was quiet, almost too quiet. The streetlights outside the park cast long, thin shadows across the grass, but inside the park itself, darkness swallowed everything beyond the circle of light around the lamp posts. I kept my pace steady, headphones off so I could hear the sounds of the night. My breath came out in short, sharp puffs, and the air smelled damp like the smell after rain, even though it hadn't rained that evening. As I ran past the playground, I noticed the swings first. I slowed down, thinking about the kids who usually hung around there after school. But there was no one. The swings moved slightly back and forth, creaking in the night. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just the metal reacting to the cold air, or maybe a small gust of wind. But when I stopped and listened, I realized the air was completely still. Not a leaf was stirring, not a single sound except the faint rustle of my shoes against the gravel path. I laughed nervously and forced myself to jog past, telling myself it was nothing. The slide caught my attention next. My light from the phone reflected off the smooth metal, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Wet, small, clearly made by bare feet, leading up the ladder and down the slide. My stomach sank. There was no one else in the park. No one. I scanned the darkness beyond the lampost's glow, expecting to see some figure crouching in the shadows, maybe a jogger like me, or a stray dog. Nothing. The prints were too small to belong to an adult. My pulse quickened, but I rationalized again. Maybe a kid had slipped in earlier and ran off, I told myself. Then I heard it. A giggle. High-pitched, quick, not a full laugh but a sharp, almost staccato giggle. It came from the corner of the sandbox, where the darkness was thickest. I froze mid-step, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound was unmistakably human. It was impossible to ignore. I pointed the beam toward the sandbox, scanning carefully, but the sand was empty. Just sand, raked by unseen hands, and shadows that shifted slightly in the dim light. I stepped closer, my shoes crunching on the gravel, my breath loud in my own ears. I called out softly, "Hello," but the sound of my own voice seemed swallowed by the night. No answer, just another giggle, closer this time. I turned to leave. My legs moved faster than my mind could process. I felt a cold sweat prickling my skin, my heart hammering. That's when I noticed the swings again. All of them had started moving at once. Slowly, deliberately, in a circular motion, like someone had taken all of them and pushed them in perfect unison. The creaking grew louder with each rotation, and the giggling surged behind me, surrounding me. It wasn't coming from one point now, it seemed to come from all sides, bouncing off the trees, echoing across the empty park. I ran, not even trying to keep my pace steady. Gravel and dirt flew beneath my shoes, and I could feel the strain in my lungs and legs, but I didn't stop. The sound of the swings and the laughter followed me, impossible to outrun. I risked a glance back over my shoulder. The swings were still moving, though now faster, their rhythm erratic, chaotic, and it wasn't just the swings. The shadows around the playground seemed to stretch and twist, reaching toward the edge of the light. My stomach turned as if my body knew I shouldn't look, but my eyes kept darting back. I reached the main path, hoping to find the park exit quickly, and I saw the wet footprints again, leading straight from the sandbox toward the edge of the trees, but now they were moving alongside me, as if someone, or something, was walking just out of sight. Every time I glanced down, they seemed to move closer. My hands gripped my flashlight tighter, shining the beam wildly across the path, but there was nothing there. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my roommate asking why I was still out. I didn't stop to answer. I shoved it back into my pocket, adrenaline keeping me moving. The park seemed endless now, like the paths twisted and looped back on themselves. I didn't recognize the direction anymore. Trees loomed overhead, their branches scratching the windless air. I could hear the faint sound of the swings in the distance, creaking and groaning like the bones of something long dead. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the parking lot. The street lights there seemed stronger, more solid, grounding me back in reality. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. I finally got inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a few moments, listening. The swings had stopped. The giggling was gone. The park was silent. I didn't move for a long time, just sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe some kids had been playing a prank earlier, hiding in the shadows, or maybe it was the sound of the wind shifting in the equipment. But even as I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something small and quick moving just beyond my vision. I started the car and drove home slowly, keeping my headlights on full, my eyes scanning every dark corner along the street. The park receded behind me, silent, empty, but I knew it wasn't really empty. Those footprints, the giggling, the swings, they were real. And I knew I'd never go jogging there after sunset again. The next day, I went back in daylight, hoping to see the footprints or any sign of someone hiding there, anything that could explain the night before. The playground was quiet, as it always was in the morning. The sand in the sandbox was smooth, the swings still, no sign of footprints anywhere. The slide was dry, and there was nothing unusual to see. I even checked the nearby woods and paths. No one had been there. No one. I left the park that day with a strange weight in my chest. I realized that whatever I had seen, heard, and felt the night before didn't need an explanation to be terrifying. It didn't need ghosts or monsters or fairy tales. The fear came from knowing that something could exist in the real world, in ordinary places, unnoticed until you were right there. The park, the playground, the swings, the footprints, they had been normal until they weren't. And that thought stayed with me long after the lights of Willow Creek Park disappeared in my rearview mirror. From then on, I avoided the park entirely after dark. Even driving past, I would see the playground lit only by the weak glow of a single streetlight and feel my heart rate spike. It didn't matter that nothing happened again, because I had seen that small, impossible evidence of something moving when no one was there. The image of the footprints on the slide, the circling swings, and the giggling echoing from the sandbox never left me. I couldn't explain it, I didn't try. I just accepted it as one of those rare moments in life where you encounter something completely outside expectation, something ordinary yet profoundly disturbing. The fear wasn't from danger or from someone trying to hurt me. It was the awareness that the world could hold things beyond understanding, things so small, subtle, and normal that they could slip past unnoticed until they didn't. And that night at Willow Creek Park stayed with me, not as a story to tell, but as a quiet, unshakable memory. A reminder that reality sometimes has corners darker than any ghost story could ever imagine. I was driving back from my friend's cabin late at night, the kind of night where snow falls heavy and thick, swallowing everything in a white haze. My headlights cut through the darkness in narrow beams, reflecting off the frost that clung to the branches of the trees lining Route 112. The road was empty, silent except for the steady crunch of my tires against the snow-packed asphalt. My phone glowed faintly on the passenger seat, its GPS app stubbornly insisting I turn onto a road I had never seen before. I frowned at it, knowing I should have just stayed on the main route, but the screen blinked insistently, and I convinced myself I'd follow it. The turn led me onto a narrow stretch of asphalt barely wide enough for 2 cars, the snow pushed aside in uneven mounds along the edges. The trees were dense here, branches heavy with snow, drooping low as if watching me pass. The air inside the car felt cold, even though the heater was on full blast, and I noticed a strange silence. Not the usual calm you get on a quiet night, but a pressing, thick silence. No wind, no birds, no distant sounds of life, just the crunch of my tires and the faint hum of the engine. I drove cautiously, my eyes scanning the road for any signs of civilization. Then in the distance I saw headlights. A car was parked on the side of the road, its brake lights flickering intermittently. At first, I thought it was someone stopped, maybe in trouble. But the flicker was uneven, like a heartbeat, slow and irregular. I felt a twinge of unease, a cold knot in my stomach, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I passed the car slowly, giving it a wide berth, and when I glanced in my rearview mirror, the car was gone. I exhaled, feeling a little foolish for getting nervous over nothing. Minutes later, I saw it again. At first, I didn't realize it, but in every reflective surface, the icy patches on the road, the mirrors, even a thin layer of water pooled in a depression in the asphalt, I could see the same car behind me. Always there, always matching my speed, always just far enough behind that I couldn't be sure. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I checked my rear view again. It was gone. The tracks in the snow, though, told a different story. They matched mine exactly, every turn, every curve, as if someone or something had been following me, step for step, tire for tire. I sped up, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The road stretched endlessly, the trees closing in on either side, casting dark shadows in the edges of my headlights. My breath came fast inside the car, clouding the windshield even with the heater blasting. I glanced at my phone again. No signal. Not even a flicker. The GPS had gone blank, leaving only a map I couldn't zoom in on. Panic settled in my chest like a heavy stone. I was on a road I didn't recognize, at a time I shouldn't have been driving alone. Then the car appeared again, this time closer. Its brake lights glowed faintly, casting red streaks across the snow, reflecting in every surface. I noticed that it wasn't following a normal path. It moved with mine, perfectly parallel, never overtaking, never slowing, just existing behind me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it had to be someone lost too, someone who had turned onto the same road at the same time. But the thought felt wrong, impossible, and I knew it. The road seemed to lengthen unnaturally. What should have been a few miles stretched into what felt like hours. The snow, once soft and powdery, now ground beneath my tires with a crunchy resistance, like the road itself was resisting my passage. My eyes started to play tricks on me. Every reflective surface, every ice patch, every mirror glimmered with that car. Sometimes I thought I could see movement inside it, but every time I blinked, the interior was empty. I didn't want to slow down, but I also couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut that I was being watched, that this was no ordinary driver. I remembered reading about phantom drivers, people who copy your route exactly, appearing when you least expect it. I laughed nervously to myself, a hollow, uncomfortable sound in the car. That's when I noticed the snow along the edges of the road. The tire tracks didn't just follow mine, they were identical. Every small skid, every correction, every swerve I had made was mirrored perfectly. Whoever, or whatever, was behind me wasn't just driving, it was shadowing me, copying me. My pulse hit a frantic pace. I tried to think clearly. There had to be an end to this road. I had to get to a main route, somewhere with lights, somewhere with people. I focused on the road ahead, scanning for signs, for anything. The snow kept falling, the trees kept leaning over, and the headlights of my phantom follower never disappeared from reflections. I wanted to stop, to pull over, to get out and check, but I didn't. My instincts screamed not to keep moving, keep driving until I reached somewhere real. Time blurred. My clock read 1:27 a.m., but it felt like I had been driving for hours. Then I saw it, a faint glow ahead, the lights of a small gas station or convenience store, dim but alive. Relief washed over me. I slowed down carefully, my tires crunching in the snow, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, the car was gone. The tracks in the snow, though, they didn't end. They stretched all the way to where I was, stopping just short of the road that led to the gas station. I slowed to a crawl, scanning the edges, but there was nothing. I pulled into the station, heart racing, hands shaking. The warmth inside the small building felt like a miracle. People were there, tired faces behind the counter, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I parked, looked back at the road I had come from, and it looked normal again. Just snow, just trees, just the road disappearing into darkness. No extra tracks, no car, nothing. I filled my tank, tried to calm myself with a cup of coffee, telling myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of sleep and stress. But when I stepped outside, the wind carrying the sharp bite of the cold, I noticed the tracks in the snow leading from the road to the station. They weren't mine. They stopped just before the edge of the lot. Whoever, or whatever, had been following me hadn't left the road, hadn't come to the station. And I knew I wasn't going to see them. I left that place slowly, cautiously, sticking to the main highways, headlights cutting through the snowfall. The snow was lighter now, the road more familiar, and I kept checking my mirrors. They were empty. The tracks were gone. The feeling of being watched faded with every mile. But I couldn't shake the memory of those identical tire tracks, of the car that never overtook me, of the road stretching endlessly in the snow-heavy darkness. I got home just before 3 a.m., exhausted, my hands numb, my mind replaying every moment. I checked the news, the weather, nothing unusual. No accidents, no reports of stranded cars. Just me and my memory. The road had been real. The snow had been real. The car had been real. I don't know if I'll ever drive Route 112 again at night, and I know I'll never forget the way the road seemed to watch me, the way my own path was copied perfectly, leaving me with the haunting realization that some things can follow you without ever being seen, without ever needing to speak. I don't know if it was a person or a coincidence or something else entirely, but I do know one thing. Some roads are best left forgotten, and some nights are better never driven at all. I moved into the brownstone on a quiet street in Chicago during the fall. The building was old, the kind of place where every floorboard, every door, every piece of molding had a story written into it. I had been looking for an affordable apartment close to work, and the charm of the place had convinced me that a little age was nothing to worry about. The landlord warned me that the heating system was a little finicky and that the building settled at odd hours, but I didn't think much of it. At first, the sounds were exactly that, small creaks, the occasional thump when the wind pressed against the windows, the settling groan of an old building. The first night, I was half asleep when I heard something like fingernails lightly tapping on the wall. It was faint, irregular, almost polite in the way it occurred. I chalked it up to my imagination, the kind of thing your mind invents when you're in a new place alone. But as the days passed, the tapping continued. Not every night, not at a predictable time, but always late, always when the house was otherwise quiet. I noticed it most sharply around 3 in the morning, a little before dawn, when the world outside was hushed. It sounded deliberate, slow, almost as if someone was tracing the walls with intent. I started keeping a notebook beside my bed, just to jot down the times the tapping happened. It became a strange routine. On the third night, I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to catch a pattern. At first, there was only silence, just the small vibrations under my skin, the old plaster shifting. Then, faintly, I heard something else. My own voice. The words were soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. I could hear myself calling for help. The sound was coming from inside the wall. I pulled back immediately, heart hammering, and convinced myself it had been a trick of the acoustics. My apartment was small, every noise bouncing, echoing off corners. But the memory of that sound stayed with me, heavy and sharp. That night, sleep didn't come. I kept hearing the faint taps, like a warning. The next day, I inspected the apartment more closely. There were no signs of hidden doors, no spaces large enough for someone to hide, no gaps in the plaster beyond the usual cracks that had come with age. Everything was accounted for. Still, the tapping continued. I decided to try a more direct approach. One evening, I pulled out a drill and made a small hole in the wall near where I had first heard my voice. Just a tiny circle, barely bigger than the tip of a finger. I peeked inside. The space between the wall studs was empty, dusty, just the old insulation settled in thick layers. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing could explain the voice that had spoken from that wall. I sealed the hole back up, convincing myself that I had finally gotten it out of my system. But the tapping did not stop. And then came the whispers. At first, they were fragments, words I thought I had imagined, snippets of conversation I might have had in my apartment alone. But soon, they became clearer, more precise. The voice spoke things that no one else could possibly know. The names of old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, private thoughts I had never written down or shared with anyone, memories I hadn't told another soul. The whisper seemed to be learning, collecting details about me, feeding back to me the things I wanted no one else to know. I started recording the sounds on my phone, trying to catch proof, but the recordings were always frustratingly empty. When I played them back in the morning, there was nothing, just static, the faint hum of the building settling. It was as if the voice existed only for me, and when I tried to observe it, it vanished. Sleep became impossible. I started leaving lights on, pacing the apartment, checking the locks on every door and window repeatedly. I even inspected the basement and attic, every closet and crawl space, but there was no one. No one could have been living in the walls. And yet, I could hear it, every night, always around 3:44 a.m. It became a ritual, the tapping, the whispers, the slow crawl of dread through the small spaces of my apartment. One night, I decided to confront it differently. I spoke into the wall. I told the voice that I knew it was there, that I knew what it was doing. For hours, I pressed my ear against the plaster, trying to reason with it, as if reasoning would make any difference. The only response was silence and the occasional creak of the building, and then, faintly, my own voice again. But this time it wasn't calling for help. It was recounting my day as if it had been watching me. What I ate, what I thought, things I had written in my journal, even the little private frustrations I hadn't told anyone. I stopped going out, stopped telling anyone about the sounds, stopped doing anything that could draw attention. I couldn't risk someone else hearing. The whisper was mine alone. Every night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the plastered walls around me and the tiny space behind them, and the knowledge it had of me. The fear was constant, gnawing. I began to notice myself changing, shrinking in on myself, avoiding mirrors because the voice seemed to echo my thoughts and feelings. The breaking point came when I decided I had to leave. I packed everything in silence, careful not to make too much noise. I didn't want to provoke it further, though I knew I was leaving it behind. The last night, I lay awake, listening to the slow tapping, the faint whisper of my own secrets. I realized I didn't need to wait for it to act, didn't need to know what it was. It was part of the building now, part of me. At dawn I left. I didn't look back. I handed the keys to the landlord and walked down the street, suitcase in hand, the cold Chicago wind biting at my face. The building sat quiet behind me, its windows reflecting the pale light of morning. I kept walking, not stopping until I reached a cafe across the city. I bought coffee and sat down trembling. I made a promise to myself to never live in another old building alone, to avoid the kind of silence that lets small sounds grow into something larger than reason. Weeks later, I thought about calling someone, writing about it, telling a story. But I realized the experience had already changed me. I was careful now, hyper-aware, and I couldn't explain what had happened with logic. What mattered was that I had removed myself from the place where it existed, and that was enough. The memory of my own voice speaking back to me stayed, but it faded over time, replaced by the hum of the city and the warmth of sunlight through cafe windows. I found a new apartment, modern, concrete walls, quiet but solid. No one could hide in them. The walls were just walls. I could sleep through the night again. Sometimes, when the wind howls or a pipe creaks, I catch a brief shiver, but I know I am safe. I learned that some things cannot be explained, and the safest choice is to step away. The brownstone on that quiet Chicago street is still there, standing tall and silent. I never went back, and I never will. The sound in the walls belongs to it, not me. I have my life back, and that is all the clarity I need. I rented a cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains, thinking it would be the perfect place to write. The kind of place where silence stretched for miles, and the only interruptions would be the occasional bird or a rustling of leaves. It was remote, the kind of location that looks peaceful in pictures, but makes you feel isolated the moment you arrive. I told myself I needed the solitude to focus, that this kind of isolation was necessary for my work. I arrived in the late afternoon, dragging my bag up the gravel driveway, and the air immediately felt different, heavy, damp, and cool. Pine needles littered the ground, and mist clung to the trees. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, a log structure with a stone fireplace that looked as though it could have been built 100 years ago. The smell of old wood and faint smoke hit me when I opened the door. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my boots, and ran my hands along the rough wooden walls. I liked that it felt real, not staged. I spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring. There were 2 small bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a living area with the fireplace at its center. I made a small dinner, lit a few candles because the overhead lights flickered, and then gave up entirely, and settled into my chair with my laptop. Writing felt easy at first. The quiet allowed me to focus in a way I hadn't in the city. By around 11, I had my first decent chapter drafted. I decided to take a break, and went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound. It was soft at first, just enough for me to notice if I was listening. Someone humming. Low, quiet, but rhythmic. I froze, waiting. The sound seemed to come from downstairs. I live alone, I reminded myself. I was the only one here. My heartbeat quickened. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe an animal outside brushing against the cabin. I told myself it was nothing. I went back to bed, trying to calm my shaking hands and rapid thoughts. The humming stopped, and eventually, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. It had probably been a dream. But then I saw the footprints. Muddy, wet, unmistakably human. They started at the cabin door and led directly to the fireplace. My stomach sank. The door had been locked the entire time. Locked. I traced the prints with my finger, incredulous. They were fresh, and they ended at the hearth. There were no other prints, none leading back out, just stopping there. I checked every door, every window, even the chimney. Everything was secure. I couldn't explain it. I told myself I must have imagined the noise last night, and that the footprints were some kind of mistake, though nothing about them looked like a mistake. That night, I sat in the living area, reading by candlelight. I kept the fire going this time, needing the sound of crackling wood to ground me. Around 2 in the morning, the humming came back. This time, I didn't just hear it from downstairs. It felt as though it was right next to me. I froze mid-breath. The sound was soft, close enough to brush against my ear. My body went rigid. I couldn't move. Then a voice whispered, unmistakable, clear, right in my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I leapt from the chair and ran to the door, fumbling with the lock. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. Panic clawed at my chest. I checked the windows. They were all secured. Every exit was blocked. I could hear my own breathing, fast and loud in the quiet room. I backed away from the door, sliding along the wall with my eyes darting around, trying to see what was in the shadows. Nothing. But I knew someone was there. I could feel it, a weight pressing into the air around me, a tension in the quiet that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and called 911. The signal was weak. The call barely went through. I managed to speak to the dispatcher, explaining I was in a remote cabin, and someone had entered my home. While I spoke, I kept glancing at the shadows, half expecting to see a figure step out. I heard nothing but the faint humming returning, this time so close it made the hair on my arms stand on end. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and stay calm, that help was on the way. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I moved slowly around the cabin, my phone flashlight illuminating corners and under furniture. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing. Every door and window was locked. I couldn't find a way in or out. I realized the humming wasn't random. It seemed to follow me, shifting as I moved. When I crouched by the window to look outside, it came closer again, like someone was leaning near my ear. I started shaking uncontrollably, my mind racing with impossible explanations. Then I remembered the footprints from earlier. They hadn't left, they had stayed, frozen in place. I crouched by the fireplace, inspecting the floor. The marks were wet, the mud still tacky in places. My mind went over every possibility. Could someone have hidden inside when I arrived? There was nowhere to hide, not really, and I would have heard them. Still, the evidence was clear. Someone had been here, and they had left no trace other than those prints. I stayed in the living area, clutching a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, waiting for the police. The humming stopped for a while. I sat there in the dark, sweat cooling on my skin, every nerve screaming at me. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint scratching at the back door. It was slow at first, almost hesitant, then sharper, more urgent. My heart stopped. I stood frozen, gripping the poker. The dispatcher kept talking to me in a calm voice over the phone, trying to make me relax, telling me the officers were on their way. I wanted to believe it, but the sound kept coming, like someone testing the door, probing for a weakness. Finally, I heard headlights outside. Relief washed over me so sharply I almost dropped the phone. The sound of footsteps outside, boots crunching over gravel, made me feel like I could breathe again. The door shuddered slightly as the officers tried it, confirming it was still locked, and then they approached the windows, shining their flashlights inside. I opened the door for them as soon as they called to me. They swept the cabin thoroughly, inside and out. Nothing. No footprints outside, no hidden compartments, no sign anyone had been there other than the muddy trail I had seen. The only thing left was the vague impression that I wasn't alone, that I had been watched, that someone had been inside without a way to explain it. The officers told me that sometimes these remote cabins attract trespassers who are skilled at slipping in unseen, but they admitted this one was unusual. They suggested installing better locks, and maybe a security system. I thanked them and sat in the cabin with the morning sunlight breaking through the trees, feeling exhausted but alive. I never found out who, or what, had been there. I don't know if it was a trespasser, a squatter, or someone who had found a way in without my knowledge. All I know is that I left the cabin that day and didn't return. I went back to the city, but the memory stayed with me. The feeling of someone humming right next to my ear, the voice whispering, the locked door, the footprints frozen at the hearth. I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural, they're just terrifyingly real. People can enter your life, your home, without leaving a clear trace, and all you have are the signs and the fear that follows. Even now, I can't hear a soft humming in the quiet without remembering that night. I can't explain what happened, and maybe I never will. But I learned something important. isolation can be dangerous, and sometimes the world doesn't make sense. Some things you just survive, and the knowledge that it could happen again is enough to change you forever. I write in cafes now, among people, because the safety of walls and neighbors matters more than the peace of silence. I woke up suddenly at 4:35 a.m., the kind of sudden where your chest feels tight and your mind is sharp and alert for no reason at all. The room was dark, quiet, except for the faint hum of the old radiator and the occasional creak from the building settling. I blinked and tried to get my bearings. I had checked into the Hotel Astoria in Prague earlier that evening. The lobby had been grand, with polished wood, chandeliers, and walls lined with antique mirrors. I had laughed to myself, thinking how strange it was that a hotel would advertise mirrors as part of its charm, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. The first thing I noticed, the moment my eyes adjusted to the darkness, was the mirror opposite the bed. It wasn't just reflecting the room, it seemed different. I could see myself, of course, sitting on the edge of the bed, but behind me, another face was there. I froze. It wasn't my face. It was pale, almost too pale, and it had a wide, calm smile that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The eyes were hollow, dark in a way that felt deep and endless, like they were staring through me rather than at me. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The face didn't disappear. It stayed there, perfectly still, except for the faintest movements at the corners of its lips. I turned slowly to look behind me, my body tense, heart thumping in a way that made my chest ache. The room was empty. Just the bed, the small nightstand, and the door leading to the hallway. Nothing. When I turned back, the face had moved. Not far, but closer, close enough that the edge of the smile was almost at the same level as mine. My heart was hammering, and I could feel a dry, cold sweat forming along my spine. The more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just moving closer in the reflection. It was leaning in, almost pressing toward me through the glass. I instinctively took a step back, but the floor beneath me felt slippery with tension, my feet unsteady, my mind racing for some rational explanation. I forced myself to breathe slowly, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a reflection in the glass catching the shadows wrong. But then it whispered. The voice was low, barely audible, but it reached inside my mind like a physical touch. "You'll stay with me." I stumbled back from the bed and toward the door. My hand fumbled with the lock. My body was trembling so badly I thought I might fall over. When I finally opened the door and stepped into the hallway, I almost collapsed from relief. The hallway was dimly lit, the carpet thick and muffled under my feet. I thought maybe if I left the room, it would be over. But the hallway mirrors caught my movement instantly. I stopped and looked at one of them. At first, it seemed normal, me walking alone. But as my eyes focused, I realized the same pale, smiling face was behind me, mimicking my every step. I turned quickly. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I turned back to the mirror. There it was, moving closer, exactly as it had in the room. Every time I moved, it stayed just behind me, just close enough to make me feel like it could reach out and touch my shoulder. I forced myself to keep moving, trying not to look directly at any mirrors. I went down the hallway, past doors to other rooms, past the small seating area where a faded velvet couch sat under another gilded mirror. Every reflective surface seemed to catch it. Every angle seemed to show it just behind me, grinning silently. I reached the elevator and pressed the button. My hands shook so badly, I thought I might press every button at once. The elevator doors opened with a mechanical groan, and I stepped inside. I pressed the lobby button and leaned against the wall, trying to slow my racing heart. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. The elevator had no mirrors, just metal panels, dim overhead lights, and the faint smell of machine oil. The doors opened. I stepped out, thinking I could run straight to the lobby and out of the hotel. But the lobby was strange in the early morning. The chandeliers hung motionless, the polished wood counters glistened under weak lighting, and the mirrors lining the walls reflected me, and the same face. It stood just behind me in every reflection, patient, silent, smiling. I froze. No one else was in the lobby, no sound but the hum of lights and the occasional squeak of a chair. I forced myself to look away from the mirrors, trying to ignore what I saw. I ran to the main doors, threw them open, and stepped into the quiet streets of Prague. The cold air hit my face and made me gasp. I kept running until the hotel disappeared behind me in the misty morning haze. I thought maybe if I got far enough, whatever I had seen would stay behind. I didn't stop running until I reached a small cafe just starting to open for the day. The smell of coffee and fresh bread grounded me slightly. I sat at a table, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of it all. My hands were still shaking, and I felt drained, like I had been running for hours. Then I caught my reflection in the cafe window. For a second, I thought I had escaped. But there it was behind me, almost imperceptibly at first, and then clearer, smiling, pale, eyes hollow. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I leaned closer to the window, heart hammering. It wasn't in the room with me. It was in the reflection, following me wherever I went. I realized then that this wasn't something I could run from. I couldn't destroy it. It wasn't in the room, or in the building, but it followed me through every reflective surface. I tried turning away from every window, avoiding mirrors, but even the faintest glint on a shop window, the shiny surface of a car, a small metallic object, caught its image. Always behind me, always watching, always smiling. I spent the next hours walking the streets of Prague, waiting for daylight to break fully, trying to convince myself that daylight would make it disappear. But it didn't. Only the angle of light changed its clarity, sometimes sharper, sometimes faint, but it never left. I started to notice it in other people's reflective surfaces too, the silver handle of a coffee pot, the polished wood of a counter. I had a moment of panic, thinking I was hallucinating, but every detail was consistent, precise, impossible to ignore. By the time the sun was fully up, the reflection had faded enough to make me feel slightly sane, but the memory of its face haunted me. The hollowness of its eyes, the unnerving calm of its smile. I knew I would never check into another hotel with antique mirrors. I didn't even want to look at any reflective surface for a while. I stayed in a small cafe, drinking coffee, watching the sunlight hit the streets, and forcing myself to focus on anything but reflections. Eventually, I left Prague, taking a train early in the afternoon, choosing a window seat but never looking out of it. Even then, I thought I could see that pale smile lurking in the glass of the train window whenever I caught my own reflection. I kept my gaze down, kept my hands on my lap, and tried to keep myself grounded in the physical world. It took days before I could sleep normally. Nights were the hardest. Even with the lights on, I kept catching the edge of it in any reflective surface. But over time, the image stopped moving. It was always behind me, always just beyond reach, but no longer advancing. I learned to live with it, to avoid unnecessary mirrors, to keep reflections out of my sight as much as possible. I still think about that face. I still feel it watching me, not like a ghost or a spirit, but like something embedded in the way mirrors work, in the way light catches surfaces. Something that waits quietly, patient, knowing I will always see it if I allow myself to look. I don't check into hotels anymore. I avoid polished furniture. I've even stopped driving at night in cities with reflective windows. It's always there, behind me, waiting, smiling, hollow. I've learned that running doesn't work, but neither does hiding. The only thing I can do is live my life carefully, aware that the reflection is never far, never absent, always part of my vision if I allow it. And in a strange way, knowing it will always be behind me makes me careful, makes me deliberate in how I move, how I live, how I see. The mirror taught me that some things aren't meant to be confronted, aren't meant to be destroyed. They are meant to be acknowledged, remembered, and avoided. And I will always remember. I waited at Shinjuku Station for the last train, the loud hum of fluorescent lights above my head echoing through the nearly empty hall. The usual chaos of the station, pushing crowds, suitcases clattering, announcements blaring, was gone. Only the soft clatter of distant cleaning crews and the occasional squeak of a trolley on tiles reminded me that the station was alive. My headphones blocked out the low, constant rumble of trains and the faint buzz of vending machines along the platform. I could feel the hollow echo of my own footsteps as I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. My eyes scanned the platform, lit with harsh white light, reflecting off the polished concrete floors, the empty benches, the occasional forgotten bag or umbrella left behind by someone rushing home. Time seemed slow. I could hear the faint hiss of air through vents and the distant rumble of a train arriving or departing in the other part of the station, but no one was near me. I checked the clock on the wall, 11:59 p.m. Only 1 minute before the final departure. I adjusted my backpack, feeling the straps dig into my shoulders, and tried to calm the nagging unease crawling up my spine. It was just the late hour, I told myself, just the emptiness of the station. Nothing more. Then it happened. The speakers above the platform crackled, the usual white noise and automatic announcements stuttering for a beat, and a voice came through. At first, I thought it was some malfunction. But as the words registered, my stomach dropped. The voice sounded exactly like mine. Clear, flat, but undeniably my own. Don't leave. I ripped my headphones off so fast I nearly dropped them. My ears rang, and I pressed my palms over them, hoping it was just a trick of sound, a glitch in the system. But the platform was empty, save for me. The screens above the ticket gates, the scrolling LED panels that usually displayed train schedules and delays, all flashed the same words, one after another. My name. My full name. And below it, the command repeated, "Don't leave." I staggered back, heart hammering. The emptiness of the station felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I could see the train still running on the tracks, lights flashing as they pulled in and out of the station, but there was a strange silence around me, like the world had paused just for me. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was some weird combination of exhaustion, too much caffeine, and the eerie quiet of a city that never truly sleeps. But then I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought they were people, moving oddly with the faint flicker of the overhead lights. Then I realized they weren't moving naturally. They mirrored me. Every shadow against the walls and along the corridors, every faint reflection in the polished floors, walked like me, stood like me, and stared like me. It was subtle at first. A tilt of a head, a shift in stance. Then more obvious. There was one in the distance, near the vending machines, with the same slouch in the shoulders I have when I'm tired. Another leaned against a pillar, exactly like I do when I wait. I froze, unable to look away. Each shadow, or figure, moved independently but in perfect imitation of me. They weren't real people, they didn't make a sound. Yet the way they mirrored me made me question every step I'd ever taken in the station. My mind raced. I needed to get to my train. I had to leave. I could feel panic climbing in my chest, squeezing my lungs. I ran. My shoes slapped against the polished floor. I ignored the flickering lights above, the sudden metallic tang of the station air that seemed sharper now, almost biting. The ticket gates were ahead. I reached them, swiping my pass with trembling hands. The gates opened with a quiet beep, and I rushed through. But the shadows followed. They moved against the flow of where people should have been, bending corners before I reached them, appearing in reflections where nothing should have been. My train arrived. The brakes hissed, and the doors slid open with their usual mechanical precision. I expected to see passengers, tired commuters, the occasional late-night traveler. But the car was empty. The lights inside were harsh and fluorescent, illuminating the clean seats and metal poles, nothing else. I hesitated, feeling a cold weight in my chest. Something was wrong. Then I saw it. At the far end of the car, a figure sat alone. At first, I thought it was a stranger. But the posture, the tilt of the head, the faint, impossible smile, it was me. Sitting there as if waiting for me. Watching me. My stomach churned, my throat tightened. The logical part of my brain screamed this was impossible, but my eyes didn't lie. Every small detail matched me exactly. The way my backpack rested against my knee, the way my hair fell forward slightly, the subtle tension in my shoulders. I wanted to run, to close my eyes and pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. My legs felt glued to the floor. I took a step forward, and the figure didn't move. The doors closed behind me, the train lights flickered slightly, and the rumble of the tracks beneath us reminded me that I was moving even as everything else seemed suspended. Then I noticed something in the reflection of the window across from the seat. The rest of the car was still empty. No other shadows, no other doubles. Just me. But the figure at the far end remained perfectly still, smiling, unblinking. I wanted to look away, to force myself to focus on the passing lights outside the tunnel, anything to distract myself. But I couldn't. My gaze kept snapping back, caught by that impossible twin. Panic gave way to clarity, strangely. I realized that the voice, the shadows, the figure, they weren't supernatural. They weren't ghosts or hallucinations in the mystical sense. They were a projection, a message, a warning. My reflection, my doubles, weren't trying to harm me. They were telling me something I hadn't listened to. They were all the parts of myself I had been ignoring, the pieces I had pushed away in the rush of daily life. The station, the empty platform, the flashing name, they were holding up a mirror. I sat down opposite the figure. I didn't speak, couldn't speak, but I observed it. Carefully. The smile was patient, almost comforting now, not threatening. I realized I could choose to act, to leave the station, or to confront this. Slowly, deliberately, I stood, walking toward the figure. Each step echoed in the car, matching the silent rhythm of my own heartbeat. When I reached it, the figure didn't move. I stopped, close enough to see the detail of the eyes, the curve of the lips, the tension in the hands. And then I did the only thing left. I reached out my hand, and with that motion it dissolved. Not like smoke or mist, but like a reflection fading in bright light. Nothing left but the empty seat and the faint outline of where it had been. The train continued through the tunnels. I breathed deeply, feeling a strange calm settle over me. The station, the announcements, the shadows, all of it receded into a memory, sharp but manageable. I understood that it had never been about fear or escape. It was about attention, about noticing parts of myself that had been invisible in the daily noise. When the train finally pulled into my stop, I stepped onto the platform, the lights warm and normal. I looked around, fully awake now, fully present. The station was just a station again. The passengers, the movement, the sound, they were all real. Nothing followed me. Nothing copied me. The empty platform, the strange doubles, the flashing signs, they were gone, leaving only the weight of awareness. I walked home slowly, not rushing, letting the quiet of the night settle around me. I knew I would return to Shinjuku Station another day, but I also knew I would never stand in the middle of it without paying attention again. The echo of my own voice had scared me, yes, but it had also reminded me to notice myself, to notice my own steps, my own presence. I was still me, unchanged, but more aware. And that awareness, sharp, clear, and steady, was enough to make the fear fade completely. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had returned to its usual night rhythm. Lights in windows, faint traffic, the occasional late-night worker on a scooter, but none of it felt threatening. I had left something behind in that train car, something heavy and invisible, and I felt lighter for it. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and finally, for the first time that night, exhaled completely. The last train had taken me to the other side, but the station hadn't followed. The voice was gone. The shadows were gone. I was alone, but in a way that finally felt right. I didn't feel the urge to run anymore. I didn't feel the pull of the flashing signs. I only felt the quiet, solid weight of being present, of being myself, fully, finally awake to my own steps. And that was enough. I boarded the last train at Baker Street Station, just before 1 a.m. The platform was empty except for a lone cleaner pushing a squeaky cart down the tiles. The lights flickered briefly as the train slid in, metal grinding softly against metal. I slipped into a carriage at the far end, dragging my bag behind me, and sat down on a cold plastic seat. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete and metal, mixed with the faint tang of the electrical hum running through the tunnels. Normally, I would feel a kind of relief when the train was almost empty, but tonight there was a strange tension in the air that I couldn't shake. As the train started moving, I noticed him. A man standing in the corner, close to the doors, completely still. His clothes were dark, ordinary, nothing that stood out, but there was something about him. His posture was too stiff, too deliberate, like he didn't belong to the train at all. I tried to focus on my phone, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, but out of the corner of my eye, I kept catching him. Every time I looked up, he was there. I shifted my position slightly, hoping it was just the angle. But no matter where I moved, he seemed to be in the same spot, and yet somehow he was everywhere. I could see him reflected in the windows as the train rocked from side to side. In the shiny metal poles, his image was sharp and clear. Even the shadows of the empty seats seemed to stretch unnaturally toward him. I felt my heartbeat pick up. The train rattled over a junction, and I swayed slightly. Most people move with the train, carried along with its sudden shifts, but he didn't. His feet didn't adjust, his body didn't lean. It was as if the car moved around him, but left him untouched. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wanted to look away, close my eyes, convince myself I was hallucinating, but I couldn't. My eyes kept snapping back to him. I whispered to myself, "Are you real?" Not that I expected an answer. The train screeched over the rails, the sound bouncing and echoing off the metal walls. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper back. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it was like my own voice, stretched and mirrored, soft and cold. My stomach dropped, and I swallowed hard. My hands were sweaty, gripping the edge of the seat. I moved to another carriage, thinking if I just put more distance between us, I could ignore him. The doors hissed as I crossed, the light from one car spilling into the next. The second carriage was identical in every way, empty, and yet when I turned, there he was again, standing near the far doors, unmoving. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced I must be losing it. The train slowed, the usual sound of brakes screeching echoing louder than normal. The lights flickered again. I could see my reflection in the glass of the doors, and for a brief moment it wasn't me. My face seemed stretched, wrong somehow, and I swore I saw him behind me in the reflection, his posture perfect and still. My breathing grew shallow. I gripped my bag tightly, my knuckles white. The carriage seemed to shrink around me. The emptiness of the seats, the echoes of the train against the tunnel walls, everything felt amplified. Every metallic clink of the tracks sounded like a shout. Every rumble of the train under the city seemed like it was vibrating through my bones. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. As the train approached the next station, I noticed the map above the doors. It should have been the next stop, but the lights on the map weren't changing. They stayed on Baker Street. The train slowed anyway, screeching violently, as if it had reached the end of the line. The doors opened, and the usual rush of air didn't hit me. There was no platform, no station, no tiles or lights. Just darkness. Total, thick darkness, stretching as far as I could see. I froze. The train hadn't stopped at a normal station. I could hear nothing but the faint hum of electricity running through the tracks, like the world itself was holding its breath. I looked back down the carriage, expecting to see the man still there, but he was gone. Not disappeared like a shadow fading, just gone. And yet, somehow, I felt him in the air, surrounding me, a weight pressing lightly against my chest. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think logically. Trains don't stop in empty tunnels like this, not without some reason. I moved to the doors, tried to open them, but they were locked, as they always were. My hands were trembling. I pulled out my phone, hoping for signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no service, nothing but darkness reflected off the screen. I tried to take a step toward the open doors, but the gap between the train and whatever was outside seemed deeper than it should be. Leaning closer, I could see nothing. I crouched and peered down, expecting at least the tunnel walls, but it was just a black void. The train lights above me were dimming slightly, the hum of the engine louder, almost like it was warning me, almost alive. I considered calling out, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. I listened to my own breathing, too loud, too human, in contrast to the empty silence outside. I touched the metal pole, felt the vibrations of the train, tried to tell myself it was normal, that this was just a malfunction. I had seen tunnels in London my whole life. I knew trains sometimes stopped between stations. But this wasn't normal. This wasn't a malfunction. It felt like nothing had prepared me for it. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 10. Time seemed suspended. I walked slowly back down the carriage, examining every seat, every corner. I tried to convince myself the man had been a hallucination, a trick of tired eyes and dim lights. But that thought made me uneasy. Even if he wasn't real, the train wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to stop in complete darkness with no signal, no platform, no lights. Then, without warning, the train lurched again. This time, not as violently as before, just a soft, almost mechanical shiver running through the entire car. The lights brightened slightly, and I could see the tunnel walls again. Not the void, not endless darkness, just a short stretch of brick and metal, wet from some dripping water. My heart slowed a little, relief beginning to creep in, but I kept moving toward the front of the train. When the train finally rolled into the next station, the doors opened, and it was normal. The lights were bright, the platforms filled with empty benches and signs. Everything was exactly as it should be. I stepped off the train cautiously, took a deep breath of the stale underground air, and looked back at the carriage I had come from. There was no sign of the man. There never had been anyone there. The strange pause, the void outside the doors, the mirrored reflection, all gone. Just the regular, mundane station, like nothing had happened at all. I walked up the stairs to the street, the cold London night hitting me like a shock. The city was quiet at this hour, a few cars passing by, the occasional distant footstep. Everything normal. I paused outside, taking in the night air, my hands still shaking slightly. I tried to tell myself it was all just a trick of fatigue, a combination of darkness, flickering lights, and too many late nights. And maybe it was. But the memory of that dark void, the feeling of being suspended between nowhere and somewhere, and the image of that silent man frozen in the corner, stayed with me. Even now, I know the train was real. The station was real. The void and the silence were real. And the man, whether real or not, I can still feel him there, somewhere behind the corners of my mind, in every reflection, in every shadow waiting. I never rode that line alone again after that night. Even in the middle of the day, the idea of that empty train, the darkness beyond the doors, makes me hesitate. I make sure I ride with people, with a crowd, with any noise I can find. And yet, in the quietest moments, when the world is still, I swear I can see him, standing in the corner, watching, still perfectly still, as though the train, and maybe even I, don't move at all. The experience taught me something simple and terrifying. The underground is predictable only until it isn't. You can count on schedules, lights, doors opening and closing, but there is always the chance, no matter how small, that the world inside the tunnels has its own rules, its own pauses, and its own way of showing you that control is an illusion. And that night, at 12:49 a.m., I felt that illusion shatter completely. I never forgot it, and I never will.